and all of a sudden he jumps in the back seat from the passenger side and puts a knife up to my throat. I just froze.
He was obsessed with bondage, and that really is the only negative thing you can say about this.
He is putting his whole strength into pulling this chain, and I just thought, I'm going to die. I can't breathe.
Imagine vanishing into the hands of strangers, and for the next 7 years, the world forgets you exist. This is the story of Colleen Stan, better known as the girl in the box. In the spring of 1977, Colleen, a bright-eyed 20-year-old hitchhiker, set out on what should have been a simple trip from Oregon to California. She never made it. Instead, she stepped into a nightmare that would test the limits of human survival. Colleen accepted a ride from a young couple, Cameron and Janice Hooker. On the surface, they looked like any other husband and wife, but beneath the smiles was a darkness few could imagine. Within hours, Colleen was chained, blindfolded, and placed inside a coffin-like wooden box built to silence her screams. That box would become her prison. For the next 7 years, she would live inside it, hidden beneath her captor's bed, enduring conditions that defy belief. Authorities later called her ordeal one of the most extreme cases of prolonged captivity in American history. And yet, what shocks people even more is not just what happened to Colleen, but what she endured, what she believed, and the impossible choices she made to survive. At first glance, Colleen seemed to have vanished without a trace. To her friends and family, she was just another young woman lost to the dangers of hitchhiking in the late 1970s. But in truth, she was less than 100 miles away, trapped in silence, her captor convincing her that escape was impossible. The twist? During those years, Colleen was sometimes allowed to walk in public. She even visited her family once, with her captors by her side. And yet she returned willingly to the box. How could such a thing happen? How could someone so full of life become so powerless, so controlled, that freedom felt like a threat? This is not just a story of cruelty. It is also a story of manipulation, of fear, and of the fragile boundaries between victim and survivor. The case of the girl in the box, 7 years of captivity and survival, forces us to confront an unsettling question. If you had been in Colleen Stan's place, would you have survived? Don't look away, because the truth behind this story will shock you in ways you never imagined. Before she became known as the girl in the box, Colleen Stan was simply Colleen, a young woman in her early 20s, with dreams no different from those of her friends. Born in Oregon in 1957, she grew up in a modest, working-class family. Her childhood was not extraordinary, but it was full of warmth, laughter, and the kind of simple moments that make up an ordinary American life. She was the middle child in her family. Her parents described her as adventurous, independent, and a little headstrong. Colleen loved music, camping, and long summer evenings spent outdoors. Like many young people of the 1970s, she believed in freedom. Hitchhiking was not just a way to travel, it was almost a cultural statement, a symbol of trust in strangers and in the open road. That spirit of adventure guided her on the day she set out for California in May 1977. She was heading to a birthday celebration in Northern California, excited to spend time with friends. The route from Oregon to California was familiar to many hitchhikers. The road stretched wide, the sky endless, and to Colleen, the world felt full of possibility. But beneath that optimism, the late 1970s carried an undercurrent of fear. Across America, crime rates were rising. The innocence of the free love 1960s had begun to give way to a more dangerous reality. Families worried about their daughters traveling alone. Stories of missing women occasionally made the evening news, though they often vanished quickly from the headlines. Colleen's parents remembered their daughter as brave, but also trusting. She didn't believe in the worst of people. To her, the world was more kind than cruel. And so, when she decided to hitchhike south, it didn't feel reckless. It felt normal. At the time, her life seemed to stretch ahead with countless opportunities. She was considering her future, perhaps more schooling, perhaps marriage one day, perhaps nothing more than the simple joys of youth. In many ways, she embodied the hope of her generation, a belief that life would open up if you were willing to take a chance. And that's what made her disappearance so devastating. To her family, the silence was unbearable. A daughter who called often suddenly vanished. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and every phone that didn't ring became another reminder of loss. The world around Colleen was moving forward. Disco songs on the radio, political debates on TV, a culture shifting rapidly. But for her parents, time stopped in 1977. Every morning began with the same unanswered question. Where was Colleen? What they could not know was that Colleen was closer than anyone imagined. Caught in a trap she could not explain, living a reality that no one could have predicted. Even in those early days, before the horror fully unfolded, there were subtle cracks in the story. Cracks that, if noticed, might have changed everything. Behind the mask of a seemingly ordinary couple who had offered Colleen a ride, an unimaginable secret was about to emerge. At first, Colleen believed she was caught in a terrifying but temporary ordeal. Hours became days and days became weeks. The moments she thought might bring release only deepened her despair. Cameron Hooker's methods were not chaotic. They were systematic. He had studied how to strip someone of hope without ever lifting a hand. He convinced Colleen that her life no longer belonged to her. Every word, every gesture carried the weight of authority. He told her there was an organization watching her every move, a faceless power that would destroy her if she disobeyed. This lie, repeated again and again, began to sound like truth. The fear took root. Isolation became her new reality. In the dark box beneath his bed, she was left alone with nothing but her own thoughts. The air was hot, heavy, and stale. Hours stretched into endless silence. She could not see light. She could not measure time. The world outside felt like a fading memory. Inside that wooden coffin, her mind battled not only fear, but the slow erosion of identity. Sometimes he would lift the lid, pull her out, and act as if nothing was strange. She might sit at the table, eat a simple meal, even hear music in the background. And then, without warning, she would be returned to darkness. These brief glimpses of normal life confused her, made her wonder if escape was possible, only to crush the thought by reminding her of the punishment that would follow. Janice's presence made the situation even harder to understand. As Cameron's wife, she often stood nearby, silent, watching. Sometimes she showed flashes of sympathy, even small kindnesses. A glass of water, a gentle word. But she never unlocked the chains. She never opened the door for good. Her silence reinforced the illusion that Colleen had no allies, no place to turn. As weeks turned into months, Colleen's body weakened, but her spirit fought to hold on. Yet the rules of her captivity shifted constantly. One day she was allowed to breathe fresh air in the backyard. The next she was sealed in the box for 23 hours straight. The unpredictability was part of the control. Hope could not take root if nothing was certain. From the outside, it might seem impossible to understand why she didn't run the first chance she had. But by then, she no longer believed freedom was within reach. Cameron had broken her sense of choice. Escape was no longer about distance. It was about daring to defy a reality she had been forced to accept. Silence, darkness, rare light, fleeting moments of kindness, and overwhelming waves of fear. Each fragment chipped away at the person she once was. And in those cracks, Cameron built his power. If someone had been watching more closely, if someone had noticed the strangeness of this young woman's disappearance, perhaps her story would have taken another path. But in those years, the cracks remained invisible, and the prison she lived in was not only made of wooden chains, but of fear that reached far beyond the box itself. The years that followed became a cycle of torment that seemed endless. Colleen's world shrank to the dimensions of a wooden coffin, barely high enough for her to breathe, barely wide enough for her to shift her body. For most of each day, she lay trapped beneath Cameron Hooker's bed, while the sounds of ordinary life continued above her. Footsteps, the creak of the floor, the voice of a child. Sometimes she was kept inside for weeks at a time, emerging only for moments that reminded her of everything she had lost. When the lid opened, the sudden rush of air felt like a gift. Yet it was only ever temporary. Darkness always followed. Cameron created rituals of control. He tested how long she could endure silence, how little food she could survive on, how far fear could reach before breaking her spirit. He recorded his rules in detail, as though her suffering was part of an experiment. For Colleen, time dissolved. Hours bled into days and days into years. Her body grew frail. Her skin bore the marks of captivity. Her mind, too, bent under the weight of Cameron's illusions. She believed she was watched, that her family was at risk, that escape would mean destruction. This belief became her reality. Yet there were moments when Cameron allowed her out into the open world. He walked her in public, even took her to visit her parents. In photographs from that visit, Colleen appears thin, subdued, but alive. Her family never suspected the truth. They thought she had joined a strict religious group or chosen a path far from home. When she hugged her mother goodbye, no one could imagine she would return to captivity willingly. This was the deepest tragedy. Freedom was within reach, yet invisible to her. The invisible chains held tighter than any lock. Years passed. Seasons changed. Outside, life moved forward. New presidents, new fashions, new songs on the radio. Inside the box, time was frozen. 7 years is long enough for a child to grow into a teenager. Long enough for memories to fade. Long enough for the world to forget. But for Colleen, each moment of those 7 years was carved into her skin, etched into her soul. The cruelty reached its peak when Cameron told her she would become his permanent slave, a role he claimed was sanctioned by the mysterious organization. He drafted contracts, forced her to sign them, declaring her his property. For Colleen, there was no line left between survival and surrender. She obeyed because disobedience meant death, not just for her, but for those she loved. In those moments, the human spirit bends in ways outsiders cannot comprehend. She adapted to a reality that was unimaginable. She learned to survive not by fighting, but by enduring. That endurance, though, carried its own cost. By the time her ordeal neared its end, Colleen had lost 7 years of youth, 7 years of dreams, 7 years of freedom. What remained was a survivor, but also a haunting reminder of how far cruelty can go when no one sees the signs and when the cracks remain hidden for too long. When Colleen's captivity finally came to an end, the world she returned to was not the same world she had left behind. It was 1984. 7 years had vanished from her life. For the first time, she was free, yet freedom did not come easily. Her release was not dramatic, not a sudden rescue by authorities. It was the result of Janice Hooker, Cameron's wife, finally stepping forward. Janice had grown tired of living under Cameron's control. After years of silence, she confessed to Colleen that the so-called organization had never existed. The powerful threat that had ruled her life for so long was nothing more than Cameron's invention. For Colleen, it was like waking from a nightmare and realizing the walls around her were made of smoke. In August 1984, Colleen walked out of the Hooker house and back into a world that believed she was long gone. At first, she told no one. She returned to her family quietly, trying to reclaim fragments of a life she had lost. It was Janice who went to the police, revealing everything Cameron had done. The trial that followed shocked the nation. Reporters filled the courtroom, desperate to understand how such cruelty could have remained hidden for so long. The public struggled with disbelief. How could a young woman be held for 7 years, sometimes allowed outside, and never run? To many, it seemed impossible. But to Colleen, the answer was simple. Fear is stronger than chains. Cameron Hooker faced charges of kidnapping, sexual assault, and false imprisonment. The evidence was overwhelming. Colleen testified, her voice steady but scarred by years of silence. She described the box, the rules, the threats, the lies. Each word painted a picture of torment so severe that even seasoned investigators were stunned. Yet the defense tried to twist the story. They suggested Colleen had consented, that she had chosen to stay, that her visits home proved she was free. It was a cruel attempt to blur the line between victim and survivor, to make the unimaginable sound voluntary. For Colleen, reliving those years in front of strangers was another kind of prison, but the jury saw through the lies. In 1985, Cameron Hooker was convicted and sentenced to 104 years in prison. The verdict sent a message that his manipulations, his contracts, his invented organization could not erase the truth. Still, questions lingered. Why had Janice, who had stood by for so long, walked free after testifying against her husband? Was she a victim herself or an accomplice? The debate divided opinion. Some saw her as another woman crushed by Cameron's domination. Others believed she should have faced justice for her role in Colleen's suffering. For Colleen, the aftermath was complicated. She tried to rebuild her life, to work, to love, to find peace. But the shadow of the box never disappeared. Crowds whispered when they saw her face in the news. Her name became a symbol, both of survival and of a kind of captivity that society struggled to comprehend. The trial ended Cameron's reign of control, but it opened a new chapter of questions, doubts, and scars that would never fully heal. Colleen Stan's story is one of survival, but it is also a reminder of how fragile freedom can be. She entered a car on a spring afternoon in 1977, believing in the kindness of strangers, and stepped out 7 years later carrying scars the world could not see. Her ordeal forced people to confront a reality that was almost too disturbing to believe. That control is not only about chains and locks, but about fear, silence, and the power of lies. For Colleen, life after captivity was never simple. The world had moved forward without her. Friends had married, families had changed, entire years had disappeared. She had to rebuild piece by piece, teaching herself how to live outside the box when, for so long, it had defined her existence. She worked, she volunteered, she tried to create a new life away from the shadow of Cameron Hooker. Yet every step carried echoes of the years she had lost. In interviews years later, Colleen spoke not only about the cruelty she endured, but about the resilience that allowed her to survive. She described how she learned to hold on to small fragments of hope, the sound of laughter outside the window, the memory of sunlight, the belief that someday it would end. Those fragments became her lifeline. But her story is not just about survival. It is also about warning. It asks us to see the invisible prisons people might be living in. Prisons built not of wood or steel, but of manipulation, shame, or fear. It asks us to look closer, to listen when something feels wrong, to never assume silence means safety. Cameron Hooker remains in prison, serving a sentence meant to last a lifetime. But even with him locked away, the questions remain. Could this have been prevented? How many other lives are caught in places we never see? And what does it mean to truly be free after so many years of captivity? For Colleen, freedom meant more than walking outside. It meant reclaiming her voice, her choices, her humanity. She lived to tell her story, and in doing so, she gave others the courage to confront their own hidden fears. The case of the girl in the box, 7 years of captivity and survival, lingers because it is more than a crime. It is a reflection of the human capacity for cruelty, but also the human capacity to endure. When you think of Colleen Stan, do you see only a victim, or do you see a survivor whose strength outlasted the box built to destroy her? If you want to know about another story of captivity and survival that shook America, stay with us for the next documentary.